The man slammed his fist on the reception desk so hard the entire clinic went silent. "Where is she?" He snarled, his voice low and razor-edge, scanning every face in the waiting room like he owned the building, owned every person in it. "Tell Emily Grant she has until tonight. And if she makes me come back here again..." He leaned in close to the terrified receptionist, close enough that she could smell the cigarette smoke soaked into his jacket. "This place won't have a front desk to come back to." He straightened up, cracked his knuckles, and walked out without another word, leaving a room full of sick patients frozen in stunned, breathless silence. If you are watching this story for the first time, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and follow every part of this story until the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. Emily Grant had not slept a full night in 4 months. Not since the diagnosis. Not since the insurance letter arrived in a plain white envelope and told her family in clean professional language that her mother's treatment was considered experimental and therefore not covered. Not since she walked into a room she should never have walked into and signed papers she should never have signed. But Emily was not the kind of woman who sat still and waited for the world to do something. She never had been. Even as a little girl growing up in Dorchester, the scrappy south side of Boston, where nothing came easy and nothing came free, Emily had been the one who figured it out. The one who stayed late, worked harder, asked the extra question. Her mother used to say, "Baby, you've got fire in your bones." And she meant it as a compliment. Right now, sitting at her desk in the back hallway of the Whitmore Community Clinic, Emily Grant was starting to wonder if that fire was going to burn her alive. She pressed her hands flat on the desk and stared at the number on her phone. 37 missed calls in the last 9 days. All from the same blocked number. She knew exactly who it was. She had known since the first one came in at 6 in the morning, 2 weeks after she'd taken the money. $60,000. That was the number. That was what an experimental immunotherapy treatment cost when insurance said no, and the oncologist said it was the only thing left with any real chance of buying her mother more time. Her mother, Sarah Grant, a woman who had worked double shifts at the laundry for 20 years to put Emily through nursing school. A woman who still laughed at her own jokes even while the chemo made her too weak to stand up from the couch without help. A woman who did not deserve what was happening to her body and certainly did not deserve a daughter who had borrowed $60,000 from a man named Vincent Caruso. Emily had not known who Vincent Caruso was when she walked into that office on Tremont Street. She had found the number through a friend of a friend, someone who said he was a private lender. Someone who said the interest rate was high but manageable. Someone who said the paperwork was simple. She had been desperate. She had signed. And then 3 days later, another nurse at the clinic had seen the name on her loan documents, and the woman's face had gone the color of old chalk. "Emily," she had whispered, pulling her into the supply closet and closing the door. "Vincent Caruso is not a lender. He's Salvatore Caruso's nephew. Do you know who Salvatore Caruso is?" Emily had not known. She did now. The Caruso operation ran out of 3 neighborhoods in Boston, and their business had nothing to do with legitimate finance. They collected debts the way other people collected parking tickets, with casual practice of menace. And when collections stopped being enough, they moved to persuasion. The kind of persuasion that left marks. Emily's first payment had been on time. $3,000 scraped together from every extra shift she could pick up, every overtime hour. The clinic would give her every meal she didn't eat so she could pay a different bill. The second payment had been 3 days late. And the penalty on a late payment, she discovered, was not a fee. It was a visit. 2 men had come to her apartment building. They hadn't come inside. They had just stood in the parking lot, both of them in leather jackets, despite the cold, and they had watched her walk to her car in the morning without saying a single word. Oh, just watched her. Long enough that her hands were shaking when she finally got the key in the ignition. That was the message. That was the language Vincent Caruso's people spoke. She had called her bank the same day. The loan was maxed. Her credit was already stretched so thin it was nearly invisible. She had called her brother in Phoenix, who had his own problems, and 3 kids and a mortgage he was barely keeping up with. She had sat in her car in the clinic parking lot after a 12-hour shift and cried until she couldn't see. And then she had wiped her face and gone back in to check on her patients because they still needed her, and falling apart was not something she had scheduled. But now it was 3 weeks past the second payment date, And this morning, a man that she had never seen before had walked into the Whitmore Community Clinic and put his fist through the piece of her workplace, and she had stood in the hallway and listened to the receptionist describe what he looked like, and she had felt her stomach drop through the floor. Her phone buzzed again. She picked it up. The blocked number again. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Her hands were not shaking this time. That was new. She wasn't sure if it meant she was getting braver or just getting numb. She opened her messages. She thought about writing something, an explanation, a promise, a begging, desperate plea. She thought about what she could say that would buy her more time, more space, more anything. And then she typed one word: help. She sent it before she could talk herself out of it. She didn't even know who she was sending it to. The contact was labeled only with a name she had entered months ago from a business card that had been slipped under her apartment door the same week she'd taken the loan. The card had said only "if you ever need assistance," and below it a name, A. Rossi. She had thought it was a coincidence at the time, some kind of local contractor maybe, or a community resource card. She'd entered the number out of habit and forgotten about it. She hadn't connected the name to anything because she hadn't wanted to connect the name to anything. She was connected now. The reply came in 47 seconds. Stay where you are. Emily read those 3 words 4 times. Her heart was doing something strange and complicated inside her chest. She looked up at the hallway around her. The clinic was its usual organized chaos. 2 patients waiting on the bench for blood draws. Old Mr. Petersfield arguing with the billing coordinator about his copay, same as every Tuesday. The low hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of a television in the waiting room playing a daytime talk show. Normal. Everything looked completely normal. And somewhere out there, something very not normal had just been set into motion. She put her phone down and went back to work because what else was she supposed to do? She took blood pressure readings. She updated 3 charts. She helped walk a post-surgery patient to the bathroom and back, moving slowly, talking to him about his grandkids to keep his mind off the pain. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The ability to be completely present with a patient while the rest of her life was coming apart at the seams was something she had developed the same year her year left, and her mother started working double shifts, and she had gotten very, very good at it over the years. But her eyes kept going to the front door. They came at 20 minutes past noon. Not the same man who had come that morning. 2 different men. Bigger, quieter in the way that dangerous things are quiet, the way a storm sounds quiet right before it arrives. They didn't slam anything this time. They just walked in and stood in the middle of the waiting room, and the entire room shifted around them the way a room does when something threatening enters it. People leaned away without knowing why. The receptionist looked up and immediately looked back down, which was the wrong reaction, and they both knew it. The taller one scanned the room until he found Emily standing at the nursing station. He didn't walk toward her immediately. He just found her with his eyes and held the contact long enough to make sure she understood that he had found her. Then he smiled. It was not a friendly smile. Emily did not move. The shorter one, built like a warehouse, arms thick with faded tattoos that disappeared into the collar of his shirt, folded his hands in front of him and waited. They were sending a message before they'd said a single word. We are patient. We have done this before. You cannot wait us out. Dr. Marcus Webb came out of exam room 3 and read the temperature of the waiting room in about 2 seconds flat. He was 61 years old and had run this clinic for 18 of them, and he had seen enough of the world to know when something was wrong before he could name exactly what it was. He looked at Emily. Emily looked at him. A whole conversation passed in that half second, and then Marcus did something that made Emily's throat tighten with a gratitude she didn't have words for yet. He walked straight over to the 2 men. Can I help you, gentlemen? The tall one turned his smile on Marcus. We're here to see Emily Grant. Personal matter. Ms. Grant is working, Marcus said, and his voice was so calm and level that it belonged to a completely different environment than the one they were currently standing in. If this is a personal matter, you're welcome to contact her outside clinic hours. That's all right, Doc, the tall one said. We'll wait. I'm afraid that's not something we can accommodate. This is a medical facility. Our waiting room is for patients. The shorter one looked at the tall one. Something passed between them. Then the tall one tilted his head, still smiling, and said, You know what will make this real simple? Tell Emily to come out here and talk to us for 5 minutes, and then we'll get out of your hair. Or we can stand here for the next 2 hours and watch how many of your patients decide they don't want to wait in the same room as us. Your call, Doc." Marcus held the man's gaze for a full 3 seconds. Then he turned and looked at Emily again. His eyes said, "Your call, not mine." Emily came around this nursing station. "It's okay," she said, "though nothing about this was okay. I've got this." She walked up to the two men and stopped in a spot where she could see both of them at once, a habit she hadn't known she'd developed until this moment. The tall one dropped the smile, which was somehow worse than the smile. "You're a hard woman to reach, Emily," he said. "I've been working." "Vincent's not interested in your work schedule. Tell Vincent I need 2 more weeks. I've got extra shifts lined up. We're past the 2 weeks conversation," the shorter one said. His voice was different from what she'd expected, flat and quiet and very still. "Vincent's moving to a different kind of conversation now." "What does that mean?" The tall one took one step closer, just one step. Calculated, deliberate, close enough to make the point, not close enough to cross a visible line. "It means," he said, keeping his voice low enough that only she could hear him clearly, "that you've got until 8 o'clock tonight. Cash transfer or arrangement. Whatever you work out with Vincent directly. But if that number isn't moving by 8, things change. For you, for the people you work with, for this nice little clinic." He paused and let that sit. "For your mother in her apartment on Beaumont Street." Emily felt the floor tilt under her feet. He had said her mother's address. He had said it with complete casual ease, the way you mention something that's been known for a long time, something that's been available the whole time, and you've simply chosen not to use yet. The implied message was worse than any explicit threat. "We know where she lives. We have always known. We've been patient with you." "I understand," Emily said, and her own voice surprised her with how steady it was. "Good," the tall one said. She pulled out her phone. She didn't look at either of them while she did it. She opened her messages, found the last text she'd sent, the one word to the number she didn't fully understand, and she typed 3 more words. "They're here now." She sent it and put her phone back in her pocket. The tall one raised an eyebrow. "Who are you texting?" "And nobody," Emily said. He watched her for a moment. Then his gaze shifted past her shoulder toward the back of the clinic, and his expression changed. "Not much, just enough." A slight recalibration, the way a person's face shifts when they hear something they weren't expecting to hear and aren't sure yet what it means. Emily turned around. There were 3 men standing at the back of the clinic hallway. They had come through the rear entrance, the one used for supply deliveries, and they were standing in a loose, unhurried line that communicated everything without communicating anything specifically. They were not in leather jackets. They were in clean, dark clothing. Their hands were at their sides. They were very still in the way that Emily had learned today meant something entirely different from patience. The man in the center of the 3 was tall. Not just tall in a physical sense, but tall in the way that certain people are tall regardless of their actual height, a presence that organized the space around it. He looked to be in his mid-40s, dark hair, the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. He was dressed simply, nothing flashy, nothing that announced itself. But the 2 men flanking him tracked his every movement with the focused attention of people whose job it was to keep him alive. He looked at Emily first, just at Emily, and the look was not what she had expected. It wasn't calculating. It wasn't assessing. It was something quieter and more complicated than that, something that looked almost like concern, which made no sense at all given what she understood about who this man was and what the name on that business card meant. Then he looked at the tall loan collector. "You heard the doctor," he said. "This is a medical facility." The tall one had gone completely still. "Mr. Rossi, I'm not going to repeat myself." The shorter one took a step backward before the taller one did. The taller one caught himself a half-second later, but the damage was already done. The order of the retreat had told the room everything it needed to know about the hierarchy of fear currently occupying the Whitmore Community Clinic. Marcus Webb stood near the nursing station with his arms folded and said absolutely nothing. The receptionist had stopped pretending to look at her computer. The patients in the waiting room had gone very, very quiet. The tall loan collector looked at Emily one more time. The smile was entirely gone now. What was left in its place was something harder and colder, and she understood in that moment that today had not resolved anything. It had changed the shape of the problem without removing it. Whatever came next was going to be different from what had already come, and different did not always mean better. But both men left. They walked out through the front door without another word, and the waiting room exhaled collectively as the door swung shut behind them. Emily stood still for a moment. Then she turned to face Alexander Rossi. He was watching her with that same expression, quiet and careful, and something she still couldn't fully name. "You sent a one-word text," he said. "I didn't know who else to contact." "You didn't know who I was when you sent it." "I had a general idea," she said, which was not entirely true and probably not entirely false. One of his men leaned in and said something near his ear. Rossi nodded once without breaking eye contact with Emily. "We should talk somewhere that isn't the middle of a waiting room," he said. "I have patience." "I'll wait," he said. And unlike the same words from the tall man earlier, it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a statement of fact. Emily turned back to the nursing station and picked up the chart she had put down 15 minutes ago. Her hands were not shaking. Her hands were remarkably steady. She wondered what that said about her, that she could stand in the aftermath of something like that and still function. She decided it didn't say anything except that her mother had raised a woman who knew how to keep moving. But later in the quiet of the break room, while the clock above the sink clicked toward 2 in the afternoon, and the distant sounds of the clinic continued their steady rhythm, around her Emily Grant sat down in a plastic chair and put her face in her hands and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not the relief, not the strange, complicated thing that had entered the room with Alexander Rossi and was still sitting somewhere in her chest. The fear, the specific bone-deep fear of a woman who has heard her mother's address spoken aloud by a man who meant it as a warning. She had $60,000 of debt in a city where the wrong people knew her mother's address. She had just pulled one of Boston's most powerful men into her problem. And somehow, impossibly, she still had 4 more hours left in her shift. She sat up, smoothed her scrubs, picked up her badge, took one breath in, one breath out, went back to work. Alexander Rossi was still in the clinic when Emily finished her last patient of the afternoon. She had half expected him to leave. She had half hoped he would. The half of her that hoped he'd stayed was the half she was choosing not to examine too carefully. He was sitting in the break room when she pushed open the door. His jacket off his sleeves rolled to the elbows, a paper cup of coffee in his hand that someone had given him and that he was holding without drinking from it. His 2 men were positioned outside in the hallway close enough to hear a raised voice, far enough to give the appearance of privacy. Emily noticed the positioning immediately. It was deliberate. Everything about Alexander Rossi she was beginning to understand was deliberate. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She did not make small talk. She was too tired for small talk, and something told her he wasn't the kind of man who needed it anyway. "Tell me how much," he said. $60,000, she said. "Principal, I've made 1 full payment. There's late fees on top of the second missed payment, which by Vincent's math puts me at," she paused, 64 roughly. "He doesn't send itemized statements." "No," Alexander said. "He wouldn't. You know him." "I know his uncle. Vincent is a problem. His uncle has been pretending, doesn't exist for about 3 years. He set the coffee cup down. "How did you end up with Vincent Caruso's number?" "Friend of a friend. I was told he was a private lender." She held his gaze. "I was desperate. I wasn't careful, I know." "I'm not judging you," he said, and she believed him, which surprised her. "I'm trying to understand the shape of the problem." "The shape of the problem, Emily said slowly, "is that I have $64,000 I don't have owed to a man whose people know my mother's home address, and I'm a nurse at a community clinic who picks up extra shifts on weekends." She folded her hands on the table. "That's the shape." Alexander was quiet for a moment, not the uncomfortable quiet of a man who didn't know what to say, but the considered quiet of a man who was deciding how much to say. There was a difference, and Emily had spent enough years in a profession built around listening to people to know what it felt like. "The money isn't the problem I'm concerned about," he said finally. "Then what is Vincent made a threat today that included your mother's address?" His voice didn't change pitch. It didn't harden or soften. It simply stated the fact the way a doctor states a diagnosis clinically, because clarity is more useful than comfort. That's not standard collection procedure. That's personal escalation. It means either he's decided you're worth making an example of, or someone in his operation is running undisciplined. Either way, it's a situation that needs to be addressed tonight, not next week. Emily felt the cold settle back into her chest, the cold she had managed to push into a corner while she was working. What does addressing it tonight look like? It looks like a conversation between me and Salvatore Caruso that Vincent is not invited to. He picked up the coffee cup again, turned it slightly in his hands, put it down. And it looks like you and your mother being somewhere safe for the next 24 hours while that conversation happens. I can't just leave, Emily said. I have a shift tomorrow morning. My mother is in the middle of a treatment cycle. Moving her is Emily. He said her name quietly, not sharply, but with enough weight to stop her. You sent a one-word text to a number you found on a card that was left under your door. I need you to understand what that means. She stared at him. What does it mean? It means you've been on my radar for longer than tonight. He paused. Then, because she was clearly not going to look away until he gave her something real, he said, the card was not random. I knew about your situation before you took the loan. I knew who Vincent was running money through, and I knew he was operating in a way that was going to eventually become my problem to clean up. You were not the first person he'd done this to in this neighborhood. You were just the first one who actually reached out. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before it. Emily sat with it for a longer moment. Her mind was working through the implications in the methodical, structured way it had learned to work through information during 10 years of nursing, when you received new data and you had to immediately determine what it changed about everything you thought you already knew. You've been watching me, she said. Watching over, he said. There's a difference. Is there? I knew you were in trouble. I didn't intervene before you asked because intervening before someone asks is not a line I cross. His jaw tightened fractionally. People have a right to their own choices until the choices stop being theirs alone. Emily let that sit. She didn't agree with it entirely. She thought about all the times in the last 4 months she'd been alone with her fear, lying awake at 3 in the morning running numbers that never added up. And the idea that someone could have stepped in sooner but had chosen not to, based on principle, made something sharp move through her. But she also recognized the logic of it, and she was not naive enough to believe that Alexander Rossi had spent the last 4 months watching over a nurse he'd never met out of pure altruism. And she was not naive enough to pretend she wasn't deeply relieved he was sitting across from her right now. What do you want from me? She asked. He looked at her with something that might have been respect if she had any context for reading his expressions, which she did not yet. Nothing you don't choose to give. That's a very careful answer. It's an honest one. She pushed back from the table and stood up, not because she was leaving, but because she needed to move. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment and looking out at the parking lot, at the gray afternoon sky above the building across the street, at the world that had looked completely ordinary this morning and now felt fundamentally rearranged. My mother can't be moved tonight, she said. Her system is stressed from the last treatment round. Moving her means managing nausea, positioning all of it. She's not a package I can relocate on short notice. I'll have medical support there within the hour. Emily turned around. You have medical support, best. I have resources, he said simply. Tell me what she needs and it will be there. She stared at him. Part of her wanted to argue on principle the way she always argued on principle, the stubborn Dorchester girl who had built everything she had with her own hands and did not ask for help and did not accept charity and did not let anyone take care of a situation she felt was hers to manage. But the taller part of her, the part that had heard her mother's address spoken aloud by a man in a leather jacket in a medical waiting room, was already calculating what it would take to keep Sarah Grant safe through the night. And Alexander Rossi had just offered to hand her the math that made that possible. She gets cold easily, Emily said, her voice lower now. She needs her medication at 6 and again at 10. The second dose makes her nauseous for about an hour, so whoever is with her needs to know that and not panic. And she'll ask questions. She is not a woman who accepts being moved without an explanation. Emily paused. She raised me so you can imagine. Something moved across his face. It was brief and unguarded, and then it was gone, but it was the most human thing she had seen from him since he'd walked into the hallway. I'll make sure she's told enough to feel safe without knowing more than she needs to. She'll see through that. Most people do, he said. I find honesty handled in the right order still gets the job done. Emily picked up her badge from the table where she had set it down. She turned it over in her hands once. Then she looked at him. Why does your card say A. Rossi and not Alexander? He almost smiled. Because not everyone who picks it up needs to know my full name. But you're telling me. You already know it, he said. Half of Boston does. And the other half, he said, are people I haven't needed to introduce myself to yet. Emily put her badge back on and moved toward the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back. The men who came in today, Vincent's people, will they come back tonight? Alexander's expression settled into something that wasn't quite a reassurance, but was something more solid than one. No, he said, they won't. She nodded. She did not ask him how he knew. She understood in the way you understand certain things, not because they have been explained to you, but because the evidence of them is standing 3 feet away from you with calm, dark eyes and absolute certainty in his voice that Alexander Rossi did not make promises he could not keep. Whether that was a comfort or a warning was something she could think about later when her mother was safe and her hands had stopped wanting to shake every time the adrenaline eased off. She went back out to the clinic floor. She had charts to finish. She always had charts to finish. What she did not know, walking back to the nursing station with her badge on her chest and her face arranged into the professional calm she had spent a decade perfecting, was that 45 minutes earlier, while she had been taking blood pressure readings and pretending her world wasn't reorganizing itself around her, 2 of Alexander Rossi's people had already located Vincent Caruso's car parked 3 blocks from the clinic, and they had been standing near it ever since. Just standing. In the way that sent messages without requiring words. In the language that everyone in a certain kind of business, in a certain kind of city, reads fluently and does not require translation. Vincent Caruso had received that message at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon. By 2:20, he had called his uncle. By 2:30, Salvatore Caruso, 67 years old and 20 years past, the appetite for the kind of trouble his nephew had just stepped into, was sitting in a leather chair in his office with a drink he hadn't touched and a phone call he was preparing to make. The problem with Vincent Salvatore had said more times than he could count was that the boy had been given authority before he had been given judgment. Authority without judgment was a car without brakes, and Salvatore had spent 20 years watching his nephew coast downhill and telling himself it would level out. It hadn't leveled out. It had accelerated into the parking lot of a community medical clinic in broad daylight, and now the name Caruso was in the same conversation as the name Rossi. And that was a conversation Salvatore did not want to be having at 67 years old with a business he had spent a lifetime keeping at a careful functional distance from the Rossi operation. He picked up his phone. He made the call. Emily didn't know any of this while she was finishing her charts. She didn't know it when she clocked out at 6 and pulled on her coat in the back hallway with her keys in her hand. She didn't know it when she walked out to the parking lot and found one of Alexander's men waiting near her car, a quiet man she'd never seen before who simply told her that her mother was already being looked after and that there was someone outside Mrs. Grant's building who would stay through the night. She knows, Emily asked. She was told a friend of yours arranged for some extra help while you're working late. She said, and I'm quoting directly, "Tell Emily she worries too much." Emily closed her eyes for 1 second. That was her mother. That was exactly her mother. 71 years old with stage 3 breast cancer and the unswerving conviction that her daughter overreacted to everything. She's okay, Emily asked. She's watching the news and eating soup, the man said. Do you know? She seemed fine. Emily got in her car. She sat for a moment with her hands on the steering wheel before she started it. The parking lot was quiet around her, the kind of quiet that follows a storm, not because the air is calm, but because the storm has simply moved somewhere else for now. She could still feel the shape of the day on her skin like a bruise that hadn't fully surfaced yet. She drove to her apartment and went inside and stood in her kitchen without turning on the lights for a long time. She thought about $64,000. She thought about her mother eating soup and watching the news and thinking everything was fine. She thought about Alexander Rossi sitting in her break room, turning a paper coffee cup in his hands, and about the card that had been slipped under her door, and about what it meant that someone had been watching the shape of her life from a distance, and had chosen deliberately to wait until she asked. She thought about the word she had typed. One word. The only word she had had left in her at that moment. Help. She had set it to the void, to a number on a card she didn't understand, to the desperate and terrified and bone-tired part of herself that had finally run out of ways to solve this alone. And the void had answered in 47 seconds and sent 3 men through the back entrance of her clinic like it had been waiting for exactly that word. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up. Unknown number, but not the blocked one. The tone of the message was different before she even read it, in the way that you can sometimes feel the temperature of a thing before you touch it. This isn't over, Emily. Rossi can't be everywhere. Think about what you're doing. She read it twice. The sender wasn't identified. It didn't need to be. She knew Vincent Caruso's voice, even in text, the slick, threatening undercurrent of a man who had just been embarrassed in the middle of a power play and wanted her to know that embarrassment was not the end of it. Her hands were shaking now. Finally. Now that she was alone and no one needed her to be steady, her hands were doing the thing they had been refusing to do all day. She forwarded the message to Alexander's number without adding a word. The reply came in 22 seconds this time. Noted. Don't respond. You're safe tonight. Emily put the phone down on the counter. She turned on the kitchen light. She found the half-eaten box of crackers on the shelf and the jar of peanut butter beside it, and she made herself eat something standing at the counter in her work clothes, because the body kept its own schedule regardless of everything else. Her mother had taught her that too back when her father left, and the world had felt like it was ending for a while, that you ate, you slept, you got up in the morning, and you kept living, because the alternative was not acceptable. You kept living. She ate her crackers. She called her mother, who told her she was fine, told her to stop worrying, told her the man outside was very polite, and had helped her carry her groceries up when she'd insisted on getting them herself that afternoon, even though she absolutely should not have been doing groceries on her own this week. And Emily didn't know whether to laugh or cry at that, so she did a little of both after she hung up. She set her alarm for 5:30. She lay down on top of her covers, still in her clothes. She did not expect to sleep. She was out in 4 minutes, which told her something about how deep the exhaustion went. Not just today's exhaustion, 4 months of it. The kind that lives in your muscles and your marrow. The kind that no amount of reasonable rest has been able to reach, because you haven't had a moment that felt safe enough to truly let go of the vigilance. But she slept, deeply dreamlessly, the flat black sleep of a woman who has, for the first time in a very long time, handed the weight of the night to someone else and let herself believe, however temporarily and however complicated the cost of that belief might turn out to be, that it was okay to put it down. What she didn't know, lying in her dark apartment while the city moved around her, was that 12 miles across Boston, in an office that didn't appear on any business directory, Alexander Rossi was on the phone with Salvatore Caruso, and the conversation was not going the way Salvatore had planned it to go, because Alexander had information, specific information about the way Vincent Caruso had been running his loan operation, about the people he had threatened, about the addresses he had referenced, about the methods his collectors used in places they should never have entered. And Alexander Rossi had not called to negotiate. He had called to deliver a single clear requirement. And Salvatore, 67 years old and tired in a way that went much deeper than today, was sitting in his leather chair with his untouched drink and beginning to understand that when Alexander Rossi delivered a requirement, the conversation that followed was not about whether. It was only ever about how. Emily's alarm went off at 5:30, and she was already awake. She had been lying still for the last 20 minutes, staring at the ceiling, listening to the city come to life outside her window. The garbage truck 2 blocks over. A car alarm that started and stopped. A dog barking at something that didn't bark back. The ordinary sounds of a Boston morning that had no idea what had happened in the day before it and didn't care. The city kept its own rhythm regardless of what any individual life inside it was doing, and there was something both brutal and comforting about that. Emily had always found it comforting. Right now, it felt mostly brutal. She checked her phone before she was fully sitting up. 3 messages. One from Marcus Webb, sent at 11:17 the night before, that simply read, "You doing okay? Call me if you need anything." One from her brother in Phoenix, which meant her mother had said something to someone, because her brother never texted before 8 in the morning. And one from Alexander, timestamped at 2:48, which meant he had still been awake and working at 2:48 in the morning which told her something about the kind of night he had been having on her behalf. The message said, "Conversation with S. Caruso completed. Vincent has been instructed to stand down. His collectors will not return to the clinic. I'll explain the rest in person. Are you available this morning before your shift?" Emily sat on the edge of her bed and read that 3 times. Conversation completed. Vincent instructed to stand down. She rolled those phrases around in her mind and thought about what they meant in practice, what they represented in the language of the world. Alexander Rossi moved through, and she thought about what it had cost him to make that call and what it was going to cost her that he had. Because nothing was free. She knew that. She had learned that the hard way once already this year. She typed back, "I'm at the clinic at 7. I can be there at 6:30. His reply came in under a minute, which meant he was awake too or had never slept at all. "I'll come to you. Don't change your routine." She put the phone down and got up and got ready. She moved through her morning automatically, the practiced mechanics of a woman who had been getting up before dawn and making herself functional on insufficient sleep for the better part of a decade. Coffee strong. The banana she remembered to eat this time because yesterday she had forgotten entirely. Her scrubs, the navy blue ones, because it was Wednesday, and she had an irrational Wednesday preference for the navy blue ones that she had never explained to anyone. Badge, keys, bag. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment before she left. She looked like herself. That was something. Whatever had happened to her life in the past 24 hours, her face had not gotten the news yet. Alexander was already outside when she arrived at the clinic. He was standing near the side entrance, not the front end away from the street, and he was alone, which surprised her until she noticed the car parked at the corner with 2 figures in the front seats who were not pretending to be doing anything except being there. He handed her a coffee without asking if she wanted one. It was the right order, which meant someone had told him. She decided not to ask who. Salvatore agreed to clear the debt, he said without preamble. All of it. Fees included. He's writing it off as a family accounting error, which is the kind of creative language his lawyers are very good at. Emily absorbed that. In exchange for what? In exchange for my agreement not to bring a formal complaint about Vincent's collection methods to certain parties who would find that information inconvenient. He paused. And in exchange for Vincent being relocated to the Caruso operation in Miami for the foreseeable future. Miami, Emily said. It's far enough. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The morning was cold, the specific raw cold of a Boston March that never quite made up its mind, and the warmth against her palms was the most straightforward good thing she had felt in hours. "So it's done," she said. "The debt is done," he said. "Vincent is done. His people won't come near you or your mother." She looked at him. "What aren't you telling me?" He held her gaze steadily. Vincent didn't take the news quietly. I wouldn't have expected him to. Before he agreed to leave, he made a phone call. Alexander turned the coffee cup in his hands, a gesture she was starting to recognize as his form of measured deliberation. He called someone in the BPD, a contact he uses when he needs information about people who owe him money. He was angry, and angry people say things they intend as threats that become problems of a different kind. Emily felt the cold come back, the internal one that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. What did he say? He told his contact that you had borrowed money from him under false pretenses and suggested that your medical license might be worth looking into. Alexander watched her face while he said it. It's not a credible claim. Anyone who examines it will see that immediately. But a complaint, even a baseless one, triggers a review process. And a review process, even one that ends cleanly, takes time and creates noise. Emily set her coffee down on the edge of the low wall beside her. She needed her hands free. She needed to think without holding anything. He's trying to take my license. He's trying to cause damage on his way out, Alexander said. It's petty and it's small, and it reflects exactly who he is. But I want you to know about it before it surfaces through another channel. When did this call happen? Last night around midnight, which meant he had known about it when he texted her at 2:48, which meant the message had been crafted to tell her enough to sleep without telling her enough to not sleep. She filed that away. She wasn't sure yet what to do with it. Do you know who the contact is, the one in BPD? I have a name. Can you? She stopped. She wasn't sure how to finish that sentence in a way that didn't cross a line she wasn't ready to cross. She had grown up knowing that there were lines in this city, invisible but structural, and that crossing them changed you in ways that were permanent. "I'm not going to interfere with a law enforcement process," Alexander said, reading her hesitation with an accuracy that was slightly unnerving. "But I can make sure that when the review is triggered, the people conducting it have the full context. Meaning they know about Vincent's methods, his history of coercion, and the specific nature of the loan arrangement. That context changes how the complaint reads. You can make that happen." "I know people who value accuracy," he said simply. Emily picked up her coffee again. She took a long sip and thought about accuracy and the people who valued it and the people who decided what it meant. She thought about Vincent Caruso in his car, 3 blocks from the clinic yesterday, already making phone calls, already working his anger into something with edges. She thought about how much of her life she had built on clean, honest ground, every certification earned, every extra course taken, every late shift worked without complaint, and the idea that any part of that could be smeared by a man who had threatened a cancer patient's home address made something rise in her chest that was not fear this time. It was fury. Quiet, cold, absolute fury. "Tell me what I need to do," she said. Alexander looked at her for a moment with that expression she was learning to read as something close to approval. "For now, nothing. Go to work. Do your job. If anyone contacts you about a complaint, you say nothing without a lawyer present. I'll have someone reach out to you by this afternoon." "A lawyer?" "A very good one," he said. "She handles situations like this regularly, and she doesn't lose." Emily thought about the word regularly and chose not to follow that thread all the way to its end. "And you," she asked, "what are you doing today?" Something shifted in his expression, subtle and brief. "I have a meeting with someone who can make sure the right information reaches the right desk before the wrong information does." She nodded. She understood the shape of it without needing the specific details, and she appreciated that he gave her the shape without assuming she needed protecting from it. Some men in his position would have handled this entire thing without telling her anything, would have moved pieces on a board she couldn't see and presented her with the result as a gift. The fact that he wasn't doing that was something she was still processing. She was halfway through the side door when she turned back. "Alexander." He looked at her. "Why?" she asked. Not "what are you getting out of this?" because she had already asked that, and he had already answered it in the way he was going to answer it. She meant something underneath that, something she wasn't sure she had the language for yet. He seemed to understand the question anyway. He was quiet for a moment that felt considered rather than evasive. "My mother was sick when I was 19, he said. "Different illness, different circumstances, but there was a point where she needed care that no one was in any hurry to provide. And I was 19 and I didn't know the right people yet, and I didn't know what questions to ask." He held her gaze. "She got through it, but I've thought about that period of time every year since, about what it felt like to be someone who would do absolutely anything for the person who raised you, and to keep hitting walls." He paused. "You didn't hit a wall. You found a door someone shouldn't have opened for you. Those are different things." Emily stood in the doorway and breathed through the tightness in her chest that had arrived somewhere in the middle of that and showed no sign of leaving. "Thank you," she said. It was not enough, and it was everything she had. "Go take care of your patients," he said. She went inside. The clinic that morning had the particular heightened quality of a space recovering from stress, the way rooms do when something has happened in them that the walls haven't forgotten yet. The receptionist, a young woman named Daniela, who had been on the desk yesterday when the collector had come in and slammed his fist on it, greeted Emily with eyes that held an entire conversation in them. Not fear exactly, more like the careful attention of someone who was recalibrating what they thought they understood about the person they worked alongside. Marcus Webb was waiting for her in the hallway. He handed her a chart and walked beside her and said, without looking at her, "You doing okay?" "Getting there," Emily said. "That man who was here last night, Rossi." He said the name the way people said certain words in Boston, with a specific weight given to names that carried particular significance in the city's unofficial architecture. "Is that situation handled?" Emily said. "Or being handled?" Marcus nodded. He was a man who had over 18 years of running a community clinic in a neighborhood that had its own complicated relationships with various forms of authority, developed a refined capacity for asking the right question and then accepting an incomplete answer without pushing. It was a skill Emily had always respected in him. Good, he said, because I like having you here, and I'd prefer the list of reasons for you not to be here to stay short. She almost smiled. I'm not going anywhere, Marcus. See that you don't. He handed her another chart and walked off toward exam room 2. Emily fell into the rhythm of the morning. Vitals notes the small, steady machinery of care that she had built her adult life around. But underneath the rhythm, her mind was working on the thing Alexander had told her. The complaint, Vincent's phone call at midnight to someone with a badge and a desk and the specific power to initiate a review that would take time and create noise, even if it ultimately resolved in her favor. She thought about timing. A review of her license would mean scrutiny of her recent history. Recent history included a $60,000 loan from a criminal. Even if the loan was cleared and the debt was written off, and the entire situation was documented and explained, the optics of it, the way it would read on paper to someone who didn't know the full story, made her stomach tighten. A nurse with financial entanglements with known criminal operations. That was the sentence that could end a career before anyone reached the sentence that followed it. She was taking blood pressure on an elderly man named Harold, who came in every Wednesday, partly for his hypertension check, and partly Emily was fairly sure because Harold's wife had passed 3 years ago, and Wednesday mornings at the clinic had become his social event of the week when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it. Harold was talking about his daughter's new apartment in Cambridge and how the parking was impossible, and Harold deserved her full attention. When she stepped into the hallway afterwards, she checked the message. It was from a number she didn't recognize, area code 617, and it said, Emily Grant, my name is Patricia Voss. Mr. Rossi asked me to reach out. I'm available whenever you have 5 minutes. There's nothing urgent to panic about. I just want to make sure you understand your position before the day moves further. Emily read that twice. Nothing urgent to panic about. She had never seen that phrase in a message from a lawyer before. She found it oddly steadying. She called back on her break at 10:15, standing in the small concrete alcove by the side exit that she had unofficially designated as her thinking spot over the years. Patricia Voss picked up on the second ring and was exactly the kind of voice Emily needed to hear at that moment, direct, precise, without any of the soothing over-softening that sometimes passed for professionalism and was actually just condescension wearing a nicer coat. Patricia explained the situation in clean, structured terms. A complaint had been filed with the Massachusetts Board of Registration in Nursing. It was filed anonymously, which was permitted and had been flagged for preliminary review. The preliminary review was administrative and would not affect her ability to practice in the meantime. The complaint alleged financial misconduct and professional judgment concerns. Which means what in practice, Emily asked? In practice, it means someone at the board will pull your file review, your licensure history, possibly request a written response from you within 30 days. It does not mean suspension. It does not mean immediate action. It means paperwork. Patricia paused. I've handled 41 similar complaints in the last 8 years. 40 of them were resolved without disciplinary action. The one that wasn't was a legitimate complaint with substantial evidence, which your situation is not. And the fact that I borrowed money from, the fact that you entered a financial arrangement under duress and misrepresentation with a third party who has now been documented by multiple sources as operating illegally is information that I will present comprehensively and accurately. Patricia's voice was clipped and certain. The complaint was filed by someone acting on information provided to them by a person who is himself currently under active scrutiny for a range of activities that make his credibility as a source somewhat limited. Emily closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about 41 complaints and 40 resolutions. She thought about Patricia Voss saying your situation is not with the flat confidence of someone who had read the file and meant it. Okay, she said. What do I need to do? For today, nothing. I'll draft a preliminary response. If the board contacts you directly in the meantime, you say that you are represented by counsel and that all inquiries should be directed to my office. Can you do that? Yes. Good. I'll call you tonight with an update. Emily ended the call and stood in the cold alcove for a moment with her back against the wall. She thought about Alexander Rossi at 2:48 in the morning, still awake, managing a situation she hadn't even known existed yet. She thought about what it meant that he had known about the BP, the contact had known about the complaint, had already had Patricia Voss ready to call by morning. The speed of it, the completeness of it, the way the situation had been already 5 steps ahead of where she was standing. It was the most protected she had felt in 4 months. It was also the most unsettled, because protection had a shape, and the shape of this one had sharp edges she was going to need to understand. She went back inside and finished the morning. Discharged 2 patients, updated 4 charts, helped a young mother navigate the referral process for her son's respiratory specialist because the paperwork made no sense to anyone who hadn't spent years reading it. She was good at all of it. She had always been good at all of it, and the solid, grounded reality of being good at her work was the thing that kept her anchored to herself through the rest of the morning, while the rest of her life orbited in complicated patterns outside the clinic walls. At noon, Daniela knocked on the break room door. "There's someone here to see you," she said. Her voice had a careful quality that made Emily put down her sandwich. "Who?" He said his name is Detective Ray Carver, BPD. Daniela's eyes held the same carefully adjusted expression from the morning. "He says it's routine." Emily felt her chest tighten. Routine, interesting word. She thought about Patricia Voss. "She thought about you say that you are represented by counsel and that all inquiries should be directed to my office." She picked up her phone and typed a fast text to Patricia's number. "Detective at the clinic says it's routine. What do I do?" The reply came in 38 seconds. "Do not speak with him beyond confirming your name. Tell him you're represented and direct him to me. Do not explain, do not elaborate. I'm calling his supervisor in the next 10 minutes. Emily put the phone in her pocket. She walked out to the waiting room. Detective Ray Carver was about 50 compact with a specific quality of stillness that came from years of reading rooms for a living. He had a plain face and sharp eyes, and his jacket was good quality, but not flashy, and he was holding a small notebook that he was not writing in, which meant it was a prop for the appearance of formality rather than an actual note-taking exercise. He looked at Emily and she looked at him, and for a moment they simply assessed each other the way 2 people do when they have both arrived at the same situation from completely different directions, and neither of them is entirely sure yet what the other one knows. "Ms. Grant," he said, "thanks for coming out." "Detective," she said, "I just have a few questions about a complaint that was filed." "I'm represented by counsel," Emily said. Her voice was steady. "All inquiries should be directed to Patricia Voss. I can give you her number." Something moved across Carver's face. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was the recalibration of a man who had expected one kind of conversation and had arrived at a different one. He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look without flinching. She had been holding looks like this all week, and she was getting very good at it. "That's your right," he said finally. "Yes," she said, "it is." He wrote something in his notebook. She waited. He looked up. "Ms. Grant, I want you to understand that this is a voluntary conversation. Nobody is compelling you to, I understand," she said. "My lawyer's number is 617-555-0194. She's expecting your call." Carver closed his notebook. He held her gaze one more time with the eyes that had been reading rooms for 25 years, and Emily did not look away. And whatever he found there, he kept to himself. He nodded once the way men do when they have been outmaneuvered cleanly and have enough professionalism to acknowledge it without commentary. "I'll be in touch," he said. "Through my lawyer," Emily said. He left. Daniela appeared at her elbow the moment the door closed. "Are you okay?" "Yes," Emily said, and then because it was true and she needed to say it out loud to make sure she believed it, "I'm okay." She went back to the break room and picked up her sandwich and sat down and made herself eat all of it. She had a patient at 1 o'clock with a complex wound care situation that required her full attention, and her attention was going to be fully given because her patients deserved that regardless of what was happening in the world outside the exam room door. But her phone was buzzing again. She checked it, expecting Patricia, expecting Alexander, expecting any of the moving pieces of the machinery that had taken over her life. It was her mother, a voice message, 47 seconds long, which was long for her mother, who treated phone calls as an inefficient use of time. Emily pressed play. Her mother's voice came through a little tired, the way it always was these days, but warm in the specific way that Sarah Grant's voice was always warm, the warmth of a woman who had lived a hard life and found reasons to be warm in it anyway. "Baby, the nice young man outside brought me flowers this morning." "Flowers? I didn't ask him to, he just showed up with them. Said they were from a friend of yours. Now, I don't know what kind of friend sends flowers through a security guard, but I like him already. A pause, a small sound that was her mother almost laughing. I don't know what kind of trouble you've been in, and I know you're going to tell me it's nothing, and I know that's a lie, and I love you anyway. Come see me when you get off. I'll make soup. I love you, baby. Don't forget to eat. Emily sat in the break room for 37 seconds after the message ended. She sat very still and breathed very carefully and decided that she was not going to cry at work today on top of everything else. She made it to 35 seconds. Then she put her face in her hands just for a moment. Just one moment alone in the break room with her mother's voice still warm in her ear, and $64,000 that no longer existed, and a detective who had just walked out the door without what he came for in Alexander Rossi, somewhere in this city, spending his Wednesday cleaning up damage caused by a man who had underestimated what it meant to threaten a woman who had already survived everything this year had thrown at her. One moment, then she wiped her eyes, straightened her badge, and went to her 1 o'clock. Patricia Voss called at 4:57, 7 minutes before Emily's shift ended, and she led with the thing Emily needed to hear most. Detective Carver has been pulled from the inquiry, she said. His supervisor received a call this afternoon from the Board of Registration and separately from the office of the Suffolk County DA. Apparently, there are questions about how Detective Carver came to be involved in a civil licensing matter that is entirely outside his jurisdiction as a street-level investigator. She paused just long enough for that to land. Someone connected dots in a way that was not intended to be connected, and now those dots are being examined by people with considerably more authority than a detective with a notebook. Emily was in the hallway outside the break room, her coat half on her bag over one shoulder, the tail end of the clinic day winding down around her. What does that mean for the complaint? It means the complaint is now being reviewed in a context that includes its origin, which is a significant shift. When a board inquiry begins as a neutral administrative process, and then someone from law enforcement shows up at the subject's workplace within 24 hours of the filing, that sequence of events raises questions about the integrity of the process itself. Patricia's voice was crisp and precise, the voice of a woman who found professional combat genuinely energizing. I've submitted a preliminary response that documents the coercive nature of the original loan arrangement, includes 2 supporting affidavits, and requests that the complaint be classified as retaliatory in nature pending full review. 2 affidavits, Emily said. From who? One from a former client of Vincent Caruso's who experienced identical collection methods in this same neighborhood 18 months ago. She was willing to come forward. A beat. The second is a character reference from a physician at Whitmore Community Clinic, Dr. Marcus Webb. Emily leaned against the wall. She had not asked Marcus to do anything. He had not mentioned it to her today. He had just walked over to a filing or a meeting or whatever it took to put his name on a document that would stand beside hers in front of a board, and he had done it quietly the way that man did everything that mattered, without announcement and without expectation of acknowledgement. She would have to find a way to thank him that didn't embarrass him, because he would hate being thanked. Emily, Patricia said, and her voice dropped 1 precise degree from brisk to something more human. I want to be straightforward with you. This process will still take weeks to fully resolve. The board moves at its own speed regardless of how clean the submission is. But the trajectory is good. The complaint has no substance, and it has a traceable origin in a compromised source. That is about as favorable a position as you can be in. And Carver, that's no longer my specific domain, Patricia said, but I'd expect the questions being asked about him today to continue being asked. Emily thanked her and ended the call and stood still for a moment, with her coat fully on now and her hand pressed flat against the wall beside her for no reason except that solid surfaces had become useful reference points recently when the rest of the landscape kept shifting. She pushed off the wall and went to find Marcus. He was in his office at the end of the hall, the door half open, the familiar geography of the man's working life, visible through the gap, the towering file stacks, the framed certificates, the photograph of his late wife on the desk corner that he never moved and never directly acknowledged, but whose position he adjusted slightly, Emily had noticed over years whenever it got bumped by something. He looked up when she knocked on the door frame. Patricia Voss called, Emily said. Good lawyer, Marcus said. He picked up a pen and made a note on the chart in front of him, as though they were discussing patient intake. Marcus. He looked up again, held her gaze. "Thank you," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the specific way of a man who dislikes being thanked and is deciding how to navigate the next 5 seconds with his dignity and hers both intact. Then he said, "You're a good nurse, Emily. You've been a good nurse for every day of the 10 years you've worked in this building, and I'm not going to stand still while someone uses a process designed to protect patients to take a shot at you on behalf of a personal grievance." He paused. "That's not a favor. That's just accurate." She nodded. Her throat was doing the thing it had been doing all week, where it tightened at inconvenient moments, and she was managing it. "I'm going to see my mother," she said. "Good," Marcus said. "Go home, Emily. The clinic will be here tomorrow." She walked out through the side entrance and into the early evening cold, and the city settled around her shoulders the way it always did at this hour, the particular weight of Boston at the end of a working day, and she walked to her car and sat in it for a moment before starting the engine. She thought about Vincent Caruso on a plane to Miami. She thought about Detective Carver sitting across a desk from someone asking questions he hadn't planned on answering today. She thought about Salvatore Caruso in his leather chair, with his untouched drink and the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent a lifetime managing consequences he hadn't fully chosen. She started the car and drove to Beaumont Street. Her mother was in the kitchen when Emily came through the door, which meant she was having a better day than yesterday, because on the bad days, Sarah Grant did not leave the couch except when she had to, and on the medium days, she sat in the kitchen chair nearest the window, and on the good days, she stood at the counter and cooked things she did not entirely need to cook, as if to prove to the kitchen and to herself and to anyone watching that she was still a woman who cooked in her own kitchen. There was soup on the stove. There was also cornbread, which meant today was a genuinely good day, and Emily felt a particular bittersweet relief of that fact because good days were not guaranteed, and each one felt like something borrowed. "You look terrible," her mother said, the traditional greeting of a woman who expressed love through diagnostic observation. "I've had a week," Emily said, and hung up her coat and came and kissed her mother on the cheek and breathed in the smell of her hair, the specific warmth of it, and stood there half a second longer than necessary. Sarah Grant permitted this. Then she said, "Sit down. Tell me what's going on." "Mom, I'm 71 and I have cancer and I'm not fragile." Sarah turned the heat down on the soup with the authority of a woman who had been declining to be handled for her entire adult life. "I know something has been happening. That nice young man outside is not a coincidence, and neither is the fact that you've been texting me 3 times a day for the past 2 days when you normally text me twice a week." She sat down across from Emily and folded her hands on the table. "Talk to me." Emily looked at her mother's hands, thinner than they used to be, still steady, still the same hands that had braided her hair on school mornings and packed her lunch and signed every form the world had ever required of their family. She told her, not everything but enough. The loan, the debt, the collectors, Alexander. She gave her mother the version that was honest without being the version that would keep her awake at night more than she was already awake. Sarah Grant listened without interrupting, which was not a thing she did often, and which indicated the depth of her attention. When Emily finished, her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You borrowed $60,000 and didn't tell me. I didn't want you to worry. I have cancer, Emily. Worrying is what I do between treatments. You could have told me." Her voice wasn't angry. It was something more complicated than angry. "I would have found another way." "There wasn't another way, Mom. There's always another way. The other way might be worse or harder or not what you wanted, but there's always another way." She reached across the table and put her hand over Emily's. "You don't have to carry everything alone. You never did. I thought I taught you that." "You taught me to be resourceful," Emily said. "I was being resourceful." "I taught you to be resourceful," her mother agreed. "I did not teach you to be a martyr." She patted Emily's hand and sat back. "This man, Rossi. What about him? You trust him?" Emily considered the question properly instead of answering it reflexively. She thought about 47 seconds for a first reply and 22 seconds for a second one. She thought about a paper coffee cup turned in careful hands, about a business card left under her door months before she'd needed it, a preparation rather than an accident, about "I'm not going to intervene before someone asks because intervening before someone asks is not a line I cross." about flowers delivered by a security guard to a 71-year-old woman on a Tuesday morning. I think he's exactly what he appears to be, Emily said, and I think that's both the thing that makes him trustworthy and the thing that makes it complicated. Her mother looked at her with the specific expression she had been deploying since Emily was about 14, the expression that meant, I understand exactly what you mean. And also, I think you're not being entirely honest with yourself, but I'll let you arrive there on your own because you always do. Eat your soup, she said. Emily ate her soup. She stayed for 2 hours. They watched part of a documentary her mother liked about national parks, which was Sarah Grant's equivalent of comfort viewing, and Emily sat beside her on the couch and watched the light change outside the window and listened to her mother's breathing, even out as she dozed off in the last 20 minutes, and she sat very still, so as not to wake her. Outside the building in the street, she knew there was a man who had been there since yesterday and would be there through the night. She had stopped feeling unsettled by this and had started feeling something closer to grateful, which she was still examining. She drove home at 8:30. She had a text from Alexander waiting. How is she better today? Good day. She made cornbread. A pause. Then good. That matters. Get some sleep. She stood in her kitchen with the phone in her hand and thought about a 19-year-old version of Alexander Rossi watching his mother be sick and not knowing the right people yet, and not knowing what questions to ask. She thought about who that person must have been and what the distance was between that person and the man who now knew exactly which questions to ask and which people to call and which information to move in which direction. She typed, "Can we meet tomorrow? Not about business. I have questions." The reply took longer this time. 90 seconds, which was long for him. Yes, same time, same place. She put the phone down and got ready for bed and lay down and waited for sleep, which came in about 6 minutes this time, which was an improvement over 4 months of waiting for it. What Emily did not know as she slept was that the situation she believed was largely resolved had developed a new angle in the hours since the clinic closed. Vincent Caruso had landed in Miami at 7:45. He had gone straight from the airport to the apartment his uncle had arranged for him, which was his uncle's way of continuing to control the parameters of the situation, even from 1,200 miles away. And Vincent, who had inherited a great many things from the Caruso name, including a capacity for stubbornness that had never in his life served him well, had spent the flight going over his anger the way you go over a wound that should have closed and hasn't. He was not finished. He had contacts in Miami who were not his uncle's contacts people. He had cultivated on his own over the years precisely for situations where his uncle's umbrella was more of a podge than a cover. And he had made 2 phone calls before his plane had reached cruising altitude, which was a thing he would tell himself later was strategic and which was actually the decision of a man who had been publicly backed down and couldn't make peace with it. The first call was to a man in Miami named Delgado, who moved information between businesses in the way that certain people in certain cities had always moved information efficiently and without official documentation. The second call was to someone Emily Grant had never heard of. A woman named Carol Sims, who worked as an administrative coordinator for the Massachusetts Board of Registration in Nursing, and who had a cousin whose financial difficulties Vincent had resolved 2 years ago in exchange for the kind of access that never appeared in any employment file, but proved useful at particular moments. Vincent had asked Carol Sims for one thing, not another complaint. Complaints had already proven themselves to be a road with too much traffic and too many eyes on it. He wanted something quieter. He wanted the name of the physician who had submitted a character reference in Emily Grant's defense, because he had a specific idea about what to do with that name that had nothing to do with official processes and everything to do with the kind of pressure that didn't leave paper trails. Carol Sims had given him the name, Marcus Webb. Vincent had written it down and sat back in his seat at 32,000 feet and felt for the first time since Alexander Rossi had walked into the clinic hallway that he had found something workable. Marcus Webb was 61 years old. He had run the Whitmore Clinic for 18 years. He had a file with the board that was 18 years of clean, straightforward, unremarkable professional history. He had a home address, he had a car, he had a routine that had been the same for years and was therefore predictable. And he had put his name on a document designed to protect Emily Grant, which meant Marcus Webb had inserted himself into a situation he had not been born into and could therefore be removed from. Vincent's contact in Miami knew people in Boston. Vincent began to make arrangements. He did not know that the phone he was using was a phone his uncle had provided, and that his uncle's people monitored every call made on every phone his uncle provided, because Salvatore Caruso had not reached 67 by trusting his nephew's judgment. And he did not know that the transcript of those two calls was forwarded to an office in Boston within 40 minutes of the plane landing, because Salvatore Caruso's relationship with Alexander Rossi was now governed by a specific set of terms that included, at Alexander's quiet insistence, real-time notification of any further activity by Vincent toward the names they had discussed. The message reached Alexander at 9:52 that night. He read it twice. His expression, as described by the man who delivered it, did not change in any visible way. He simply asked one question. "Who is the contact in Boston?" The name was provided. Alexander picked up his phone and made a call that lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, he made a second call to a different number. That call lasted 90 seconds. He put the phone down and returned to the paperwork on his desk and sat with the particular compressed quiet of a man who has just moved pieces on a board that no one else in the room can see. At 10:47, a man Emily had never met arrived at the address of Marcus Webb's home in West Roxbury and positioned himself in a car across the street. He was one of 4 people who took shifts through the night and into the morning without Marcus Webb ever knowing they were there. At 11:15, the Miami contact that Vincent had called was visited by 2 men in the parking garage of his office building. The visit was brief. It concluded with the Miami contact making a phone call to Vincent, explaining that he was unable to assist with the specific Boston-related request and would not be available for similar requests in the future. Vincent received this information and sat with it in his uncle's apartment and understood for the first time in his adult life the complete dimensions of what he had walked into. Because it was one thing to know theoretically that Alexander Rossi had reach. It was another thing to watch that reach operate in real time from 1,200 miles away, efficiently and invisibly, as though distance were simply a logistical detail rather than a meaningful obstacle. He called his uncle. Salvatore picked up on the third ring. "I need more biomimicry," Vincent started. "Stop," Salvatore said. The word landed like a door being shut. "Stop talking. Stop calling people. Stop thinking about Boston. You are done with this, Vincent. You were done with it yesterday and you chose not to understand that. I am telling you all that if you make one more call related to this situation, the arrangement I have with Alexander does not hold, and the arrangement not holding is a problem that lands entirely on your side of the table. Do you understand me?" Silence. "Do you understand me?" Salvatore said it again. "Yes," Vincent said. Salvatore ended the call without another word. Emily woke up at 5:20 the next morning, 10 minutes before her alarm, feeling the particular clarity of someone whose body has finally banked enough sleep to start processing things honestly. She lay still for a moment and ran through the inventory of where everything stood. License complaint in Patricia's capable hands. Detective Carver pulled from the inquiry. Vincent in Miami, her mother's soup and cornbread, and the National Parks documentary. Alexander, same time, same place this morning. She got up. She got ready. She had the Navy scrubs on and the coffee made and her keys in her hand by 6:15, and she drove to the clinic in the thin early light with the radio on low and the city rolling past her window and the sense, fragile but real, of something beginning to settle. She parked and walked toward the side entrance and stopped. Alexander was there as he'd said, but something was different from the morning before. The 2 men in the car at the corner were still there. But there was a third person she hadn't seen before, standing a few feet back from Alexander, someone who had the specific quality of people who appear when situations are in the process of either concluding or escalating, and Emily had learned enough in the last 72 hours to know that the difference between those two things sometimes looked identical from the outside. She walked up. Alexander looked at her with the same steady attention he always gave her. No alarm in his expression, but something else. The considered, quiet expression she was learning to read as him, deciding how much to say and in what order. "There was a development last night," he said. She looked at him and waited. "Marcus Webb has been made aware that he may want to vary his morning routine for the next few days. He's been told it's a precaution related to a patient's situation. He accepted that." Alexander held her gaze. "I want you to know before you go inside, because you'll see that things are being handled, and I'd rather you hear it from me than read it in his face." Emily felt the cold move through her again, the the specific cold of someone else's name being added to the list of people whose safety she was responsible for because of choices she had made. Vincent. Vincent has been effectively addressed, Alexander said. This is cleanup. I want you to understand the distinction. Marcus. She said his name again quietly. He submitted a character reference. He got pulled into this because of me. He got pulled in because Vincent Caruso made a choice, Alexander said, not because of you. She heard the correction and appreciated it and could not entirely accept it because the causal chain was the causal chain regardless of where you assign the moral weight. Is he safe? He is safe, Alexander said. He will continue to be safe. That is not a question that is in play. She nodded. Her jaw was set in the way it set when she was deciding not to let an emotion move into her face before she was ready to deal with it. What do you need from me? Nothing today, he said. Go do your job. I'll let you know when there was something to know. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning was cold around them, and the city was waking up block by block in the usual incremental way, and inside the clinic, Daniela was probably already at her desk, and the first patients of the day were already in the waiting room with their insurance cards and their quiet anxieties. The ordinary world sitting right beside the extraordinary, one the way they always did in this city, cheek by jowl, neither one fully aware of the other. Alexander, she said, he waited. The card under the door, she said. If you knew about my situation before I took the loan, if you were watching over things, why didn't you put the card there before I walked into Vincent Caruso's office? Why after? The question had been forming for 2 days, and she had finally found the words for it. She watched him take it in. She watched him decide. Because I didn't know you were going to walk into Vincent Caruso's office, he said. I knew you were struggling. I knew the situation with your mother. I put the card there when I realized the loan had been made because by then the door you'd walk through was already closed behind you, and the only useful thing I could offer was a way out if you needed it. He held her gaze. If I had known sooner, I would have found a different way to help. She heard that. She held it for a moment. What kind of different way? He was quiet for a second, then carefully, the kind that didn't require you to be in this much danger first. Emily stood with that answer and let it be what it was, which was honest and incomplete, and probably as close to the full truth as she was going to get, standing in a parking lot before a 7 o'clock shift. She picked up her coffee cup. She looked at him one more time. Thank you, she said. Again. You keep thanking me, he said. You keep doing things that warrant it. She went inside. Marcus was already at the nurse's station earlier than usual, his face neutral and professional, in the way of a man who had been told something he was choosing to file under precautionary and get on with his day. He looked up when Emily came in. She looked at him. That same conversation passed between them in half a second. You okay? She asked low. I'm fine, he said. You getting there, she said. He handed her a chart. She took it. They both went to work. The Board of Registration and Nursing sent its formal response on a Thursday morning, 11 days after Patricia Voss had submitted the preliminary defense. Emily was between patients when her phone buzzed, and she read Patricia's message standing in the hallway with a blood pressure cuff still in her hand. Complaint dismissed. Classification confirmed as retaliatory in nature. No disciplinary action. No record notation. File closed. She read it 3 times. Not because she didn't understand it the first time, because sometimes the brain needs repetition to allow something good to land with the same weight it gave to everything bad. She had spent 11 days carrying the possibility of losing her license the way she carried everything else this year quietly in the part of herself she kept separate from her patients and her colleagues and her mother, the private load-bearing wall of a woman who had learned early that you didn't put your fear on display because the people around you were already dealing with their own. She put the phone in her pocket. She went back to her patient. She finished the blood pressure reading and updated the chart and moved through the next 2 hours of her shift without saying a word to anyone about what had just happened in her pocket. At noon, she found Marcus in the break room and showed him the message. He read it and handed the phone back to her and said, "Good," in the voice of a man who had expected no other outcome and was satisfied to have been right. Then he poured himself a coffee and said without turning around, "Emily, you're a good nurse." That was always going to be the conclusion of this. He turned around. Don't forget that. She did not cry this time. She had been doing better about that. I won't, she said. She texted Patricia. Thank you. The reply came in 40 seconds. That's what I'm here for. Send me a referral if you ever need one. Then after a brief pause, you handled yourself well throughout this. That matters more than people realize. Emily put the phone away and ate her lunch and felt the particular quality of a weight being removed that you have carried so long, you forgot it was separate from you. She texted Alexander. The board closed the file. His reply came in less than a minute. I know. Patricia called me first. I wanted you to hear it from her. Emily sat with that for a moment. The consideration of it. That he had known before she did and had chosen to let her receive the news from the lawyer rather than from him, because some things belong to the person they happen to, and he understood the difference. She typed back, "Thank you for that." His reply, "Dinner tonight, not a debriefing, just dinner, if you want." She looked at the message for a long time. She thought about all the things that word complicated meant in the context of Alexander Rossi and her life, in the last 3 weeks, in the shape of everything that had happened and was still settling. She thought about her mother asking, "You trust him?" and the answer she had given, which was honest and incomplete, and still the most accurate thing she had been able to produce. She typed yes. She went back to work. The afternoon brought 3 things she didn't expect and 1 she did. The thing she expected was Daniela bringing her a cupcake from the birthday box in the front office, because apparently word had gotten around about the board decision in the way that news moved through a small workplace, through walls and closed doors, and the specific osmosis of people who spent their days paying close attention to other people. The cupcake had a small note on a Post-it that said, "Knew it." Emily ate the whole thing at the nurse's station and did not feel even slightly guilty about it. The first thing she didn't expect was a call from her brother in Phoenix, not a text. An actual call, which meant her mother had told him more than Emily had told him, which meant Sarah Grant had been carrying information quietly and strategically, the way she always had a talent Emily had apparently inherited more completely than she'd realized. Her brother's name was Daniel, 38. 3 kids, the mortgage, the whole architecture of a life built far from Dorchester, specifically because he had needed distance from it. And he and Emily loved each other with the particular intensity of siblings who had survived the same childhood and chose to express that love primarily through worrying about each other from different time zones. "Mom told me," he said when she picked up. "How much did she tell you?" "Enough that I should have been there." "You couldn't have." "I know I couldn't have. I'm saying I should have been anyway." His voice had the quality it got when he was managing guilt, which was a voice she knew well, because it was also her voice. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay," she said, genuinely. "It's resolved. And this Rossi guy is handled," she said carefully. "Emily." Daniel had the older sibling tone down to a science despite being younger. "He's Alexander Rossi. I know who he is." "Do you know what Daniel?" She kept her voice even. "I am 41 years old, and I have been managing complicated situations in this city since before you moved to Phoenix. I understand the landscape I'm standing in." She softened it slightly because she could hear the concern under the pushback, and he deserved that. "I'm being careful. I'm being honest with myself about what things are, but I'm also okay. Mom is okay. The debt is gone and the complaint is closed, and I still have my license." She paused. "Come home at Easter. Bring the kids. Mom needs to see them." A silence on his end. Then, "Yeah, okay." Another pause. "I'm glad you're okay." "I know," she said. "Me too." The second thing she didn't expect happened at 3:15 when a woman she had never seen before came into the clinic and asked for Emily by name at the front desk. Daniela came back to get her with the specific expression that meant, "This isn't a patient," and Emily came out to find a woman in her late 50s, professionally dressed with the kind of bearing that comes from years of holding rooms together. She introduced herself as Dr. Constance Aldridge, Associate Director of Community Health Programs for the City of Boston. Emily said, "I'm sorry, I don't think we've met." "We haven't," Dr. Aldridge said, "but I've been following the events of the past 2 weeks, and I wanted to speak with you directly." She did not sit down. She was the kind of woman who conducted important conversations, standing up as though sitting indicated a willingness to be settled that she had not yet decided to offer. The Whitmore Clinic serves one of the highest density underserved populations in the city. We've been looking at ways to expand community health resources in this district for the past 18 months, and the events of the recent weeks have brought certain gaps in our current safety net to my attention. Emily looked at her carefully. What kind of gaps? The kind that leave a dedicated healthcare professional in a position where the only financial option available to her for her mother's care is a predatory loan from a criminal organization. Dr. Aldridge held her gaze. That is a systemic failure, Ms. Grant, not a personal one. And I would like to have a substantive conversation about what expanded resources might look like in this facility, if you're willing. Emily was quiet for a moment. She looked at the woman in front of her and thought about all the ways a situation could move through a system and create unexpected downstream pressure, all the ways that one person's desperation made visible by circumstance could occasionally force a structure to examine its own corners. She thought about Patricia Voss saying you handled yourself well throughout this, and about Marcus Webb saying don't forget that, and about what it meant to be standing on the other side of the worst 4 months of her professional life, having lunch intact. I'm willing, Emily said. Can we schedule a meeting for next week? My office will call tomorrow morning, Dr. Aldridge said. She extended her hand. Emily shook it. The woman left. Emily stood at the front desk for a moment, and Daniela raised her eyebrows, and Emily said, I genuinely don't know yet, and went back to her charts. The third thing she didn't expect happened at 4:45, with 15 minutes left in her shift, when her phone buzzed with the number she recognized immediately as the one she had been afraid of for months. Not the blocked number. Vincent's personal number. The one he'd used to send the threat the night everything had changed. The message was 3 words. Leave it alone. Not a threat this time. Not the slick, coiled menace of the collector's language. Just 3 words in plain text with no punctuation, the digital equivalent of a man who has lost everything he came into a fight with and has retreated to a position he is trying to present as a choice. Leave it alone. As though he was the aggrieved party. As though the sequence of events that had left him in a Miami apartment with his uncle's phone and his uncle's conditions and a list of things he was no longer permitted to do was somehow a situation that had been done to him rather than constructed by his own decisions brick by brick over the course of 4 months. Emily stared at the message. She thought about typing back. She thought about all the things she could say, the full weight of the last few months compressed into a response that would finally be sent from a position of safety rather than fear. She thought about what that would feel like. Then she forwarded it to Patricia and to Alexander without comment, put her phone in her pocket, and finished her last 15 minutes of work with the focused attention she always gave to the end of a shift, because the end of a shift was when fatigue made people sloppy, and she had never been sloppy. She clocked out. She drove home. She changed out of her scrubs and into the dark blue dress that had been hanging in her closet since last autumn, waiting for an occasion that she'd been too tired and too frightened to manufacture. She stood in front of the mirror and looked at herself and thought that she looked like a woman who had been through something and was still standing, which was accurate in that she looked like a woman who had not entirely forgotten how to look like herself on purpose, which was also accurate in that both of those things could be true at the same time alone. Alexander had texted the name of the restaurant, not flashy, a small Italian place in the South End that she knew by reputation, the kind of room where the food was serious and the lighting was low and the conversation was the point. He was there when she arrived, standing near the entrance, and he looked at her with the same attention he always gave her and said, "You look like the file just closed." "It did," she said. "It looks good on you," he said. And the way he said it was simple and direct and without performance, and she decided she appreciated that. They were seated. They ordered. And then for the first time since Emily Grant had typed 1 word into a phone and sent it into the unknown, they sat across a table from each other, without a crisis to manage, without information to exchange, without the specific forward momentum of emergency, keeping the conversation practical and purposeful. And they were just 2 people sitting with a bottle of wine and the accumulated weight of a very complicated few weeks between them. She asked him about his mother. He told her. She listened in the way she always listened, which was completely because she had been trained to listen for the things underneath what was being said, and it was not a skill she could turn off at the end of a shift. She heard the 19-year-old in the story. She heard the specific lasting shape that a particular kind of helplessness leaves on a person when it arrives early enough to become structural. She understood more completely than before why the card had been left under her door. Not just as strategy, as the action of a man who had been the person who needed the card and hadn't had it, and had decided somewhere in the years between then and now to be the one who left it. He asked about her mother. She told him about the soup and the cornbread and the national parks documentary and the flowers that had been received with 67 years of absolute refusal to be anything other than herself. He listened. Something in his expression was genuinely warm, which was different from the other things she had seen there, and which she decided to simply allow. "And she wants to meet you," Emily said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out with the straightforwardness of a truth that had been obvious for several days. He was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, considering. Whenever she'll make soup. "I accept," he said. She looked at him across the table. She thought about the question she had asked in the clinic parking lot 2 days ago, and the answer he had given, and the things it contained that she was still opening. She thought about the shape of the thing she had walked into 3 weeks ago, and the shape of the thing she was sitting inside now, and the enormous, complicated distance between those two shapes. She had borrowed $60,000 to save her mother's life. She had typed one word in a moment of desperation, and what had come through the door in response to that word was not just the resolution of a debt. It was a rearrangement of something more fundamental, the discovery that the walls she had been holding up alone were not as structurally necessary as she had built her whole adult life believing. She had always been the one who figured it out. The fire in her bones, her mother said, and the fire was real and she was keeping it. But fire needed air, and she had been running on very little of it for a very long time, and something about the past 3 weeks had cracked a window she hadn't known was sealed shut. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When I sent that text, the one word, I wasn't thinking about who you were or what it meant or what it would set in motion. I was just a woman who had run out of road and typed the only thing she had left." She held his gaze. "I want you to know that I understand now what I sent it into. And I want you to know that I'm not going to pretend I don't know what world you move in, because that would be dishonest, and I'm not built for dishonest." She paused. "But I'm also not built for running from things that are real. And whatever this is, whatever it's becoming, I'd rather walk into it with my eyes open than stand in a parking lot pretending I don't see it." Alexander held her gaze for a long moment. The restaurant moved around them, warm and low-lit and indifferent to the specific weight of the conversation happening at table 7, and he sat with what she had said, the way he sat with everything, with full attention and without rush. "I wouldn't want it any other way," he said. 3 days later, Patricia Voss filed a formal complaint with the Suffolk County DA's office against Vincent Caruso, citing the documented collection methods, the coercive loan arrangement, and the retaliatory actions taken against both Emily and a licensed physician following the initial inquiry. The complaint was supported by 6 affidavits, including the woman who had come forward from the previous loan situation and 3 additional individuals who had contacted Patricia's office after word had moved through the neighborhood that someone was actually asking questions. Patricia had expected 2. She got 6. That was the thing about communities that looked isolated from the outside. They were never as isolated as they looked. They were just waiting for someone to open the door first. Salvatore Caruso did not contest the complaint. He had known for years that Vincent's operation was going to become exactly this kind of problem, and he had the particular weariness of a man who was finally paying the bill for a meal he had been eating on credit for far too long. He provided documentation. He cooperated. His lawyer called Patricia's lawyer. The conversation was brief and efficient, and the outcome was not good for Vincent, who was now conducting his life under the specific weight of federal scrutiny in a city that was not Boston and surrounded by people who reported everything to his uncle. Emily knew the outline of it through Patricia and through Alexander, who gave her information in the same way he always had, in the right order, cleanly, without overwhelming her with the details she didn't need to carry. She received it the same way she had learned to receive most things from him, as data that added to the picture without requiring her to change her day around it. Because her days had a rhythm now that she was not willing to give up. The clinic, the patients, the charts, the specific ordinary architecture of a life built around being useful to people in their most vulnerable moments. Her mother's good days and the harder days that followed them, moving through the treatment cycle with the stubborn biological determination of a woman who had no intention of going anywhere she hadn't decided to go. Wednesday Soup, the National Parks documentary. Daniel on the phone from Phoenix every Sunday, now more consistent than he had been in years. The way crisis sometimes pulled dispersed families back into the same orbit. And the dinners, the conversations, the gradual, careful, mutually deliberate process of two people who had come at each other from completely different directions, deciding that direction was less important than destination. Her mother met Alexander on a Saturday. She made soup and cornbread and received him with the same 71 years of absolute self-possession with which she received everything, looked at him the way she looked at everything that mattered, directly and without performance. And then said to Emily in the kitchen, while Alexander was being asked by her mother's neighbor Harold to explain something about tax assessments, which was not what Alexander Rossi typically explained to people on a Saturday. He listens when you talk. I know, Emily said. That's important, her mother said. More important than most things. I know, Mom. Sarah Grant handed her daughter a bowl to carry and patted her once on the arm, and they went back into the living room, where Alexander was patiently explaining property valuation to Harold, and Emily stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at that and felt something move through her that was too complicated and too full to name, so she didn't try to name it. She just carried the bowl to the table and sat down and let the evening be what it was. 6 weeks after the board closed the file, Dr. Constance Aldridge's office confirmed the expansion of a community health financial assistance program at Whitmore Clinic, specifically designed to connect patients and staff facing medical financial hardship with legitimate emergency resources before desperation made the decision for them. The program was small at first. It would grow. Emily knew it would grow because she had watched the shape of need in this neighborhood for 10 years. And she knew there was no shortage of people who would have used a door like this if they had known it existed. She was asked to sit on the advisory committee. She said yes. Marcus Webb shook her hand when she told him and said, "Good," in exactly the same tone he had used about the board decision and the affidavit and every other moment of this entire situation where he had shown up without announcing it, put his name on things that needed his name, and then returned immediately to the work because the work was the point and always had been. On a Tuesday in early April, with the cold finally breaking and the first real warmth of the year moving through the city like a long overdue apology for everything March had done, Emily Grant arrived at the Whitmore Community Clinic at 6:55 in the morning, 5 minutes before her shift badge, on coffee in hand, ready for whatever the day had. She had slept well. Her mother had a good report from her oncologist. Patricia had called with a small but significant update on the formal proceedings against Vincent that she was not at liberty to fully detail, but which she had described as, and this was a direct quote, going extremely well for all the right people. She pushed through the side entrance. Daniela looked up and smiled. Old Mr. Petersfield was already in the waiting room, right on schedule, ready to discuss his copay. The fluorescent lights hummed. The television in the corner ran a morning news program. The charts were waiting. Emily Grant had borrowed $60,000 in the dark, in the desperate space between love and survival, from the worst possible source because she was a woman with fire in her bones and a mother worth fighting for, and no road left except the one that terrified her. And what had come of it was not ruin. It was a rearranged world, harder and realer and more honest than the one before it, populated by people who had proven themselves in conditions that revealed character more clearly than comfort ever could. A doctor who had put his name on a document without being asked. A lawyer who didn't lose. A mother who made soup on good days and demanded honesty on all of them. And a man who had left a card under her door and waited with the particular patience of someone who understood that real help doesn't take the door before it's opened until she was ready to ask. She had typed one word into a phone in a moment when she had nothing else left. And what that word had built in the weeks and months that followed was not a rescue. It was a life reclaimed on her own terms, with her eyes open and her name intact and her mother alive and her hands steady and her place in this world exactly where it had always been and where it would always remain. Hers.